Now I'm going to demonstrate an application for the running stitch that we've been practicing so far. So in this case, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be temporarily attaching one layer to the second layer of fabric. So temporarily meaning that I'm going to hold it together before I permanently stitch it. And why would we do that? We usually do that in the case of fittings or just to make sure that we have the correct size before we put all the work in, sewing it permanently and then finding out it's not the right size, whether it's for a cushion or whether it is for a garment. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top right hand corner here just so that it's in the field of vision here. And normally what we would do first is we would pin our line that we intend to sew. I'm going to reach over, and I'm going to use my tape measure. And tape measures, as I've discussed once before, are standardized in width, and what they're really great for is that the width of the tape measure is actually an ideal average seam allowance size. So there's nothing average about couture, but let me just start somewhere. Now, with tape measures, they are a standard width, and they happen to be a standard seam allowance width. Even though in couture there's nothing standard about seam allowance widths, they're never standard. They're always based on the type of seam that you intend to create. However, it does give a very practical seam allowance. So rather than using it this way, or 5/8, and I measure the tape measure, it is a perfect size for my seam allowance. So if you lay your tape measure down, now your cut edge has to be extremely accurate, whether it's straight or curved, otherwise this doesn't work. You lay your tape measure down and you just keep sliding it along. So first of all, you're not working against yourself, and secondly, you don't have to keep guessing or keep track of your seam allowance because it's consistent. So always work in the direction that you're not working against yourself, but it works out very, very quickly to do it this way. Now, the other option is if you have a seam allowance that's different than your tape measure, cut yourself a template. And I just use cardboard. They come from the back of pads of paper, but you can just as easily use a file folder, which is lighter in color, but the quality of the cardboard is perfect for it. And just create a custom template for your seam allowance. This goes so much faster. You don't need any special tools. I know that you can buy sliding metal measures for buttonholes and such, but they only come in standard sizes. Again, if you have something that's couture, that's something that is completely custom, then make your own. Let's assume that we want to make a straight seam line. It's a good assumption, but as you can see, the cut edges here are not very straight. So we have to establish a baseline at, let's go between these 2 points here. And I'm going to start here. This is my end point, and I'm going to measure from my center line that I've created with these marking points. I'm going to measure, and I have that measurement, and then I have the same measurement from the center line, and you can see the difference, how far over this is. Now, is this square? Let's measure it. I can measure the diagonal one way and the diagonal the other way, and it's exactly the same measurement. So that means it's in true square. If you don't have a triangle with a 90-degree angle, this is one way you can tell. So now if I want to make a straight seam, I can begin pinning, but I don't have an edge to go by at this point. So I'm going to create an edge with this tape measure because it's in relatively good condition. It hasn't been pressed and malformed because of it. It's still in very good condition. So I use that as my straight edge to fill in and pin my seam line to create a straight line. Okay, so this all seems quite straightforward, but sometimes you forget that perhaps your edges aren't straight, so you can't follow your cut edges. Right, then my next step would be then to go ahead and baste that, meanwhile removing the pins. I can remove my anchor and place it here. And as I go, I don't really like lifting the fabric. Some fabrics, because they're so delicate, such as chiffon or organza, is that they shift very easily, so you don't like to lift them off the table. Or even satin. Satin's very slippery, and it's best just to leave it on the table while you're sewing. So this again is a basting stitch, and basting is a temporary stitch that will seam 2 layers of fabric or more than 2 layers of fabric together temporarily. Now you keep hearing me repeat this word temporary and baste and running stitch. I keep repeating it because it's important. At the moment, there's no other context other than just practicing, but in the future there will be context for what we're doing. There's always a reason why we choose a certain stitch for a certain application. It's not random in any way. Okay, now I've basted it. I'm going to collect my pins. I do have a magnet, but it's not necessary that you have a magnet, only that you keep control of your tools and equipment. My scissors are closed, everything's out of the way. So here we can see that this has now been sewn together with a running stitch. It's a temporary stitch, and if I open up and look at the other side, you can see it holds together, and it would hold together well enough if this was a garment to try it on for a fitting. If this were for an occasional cushion, I could continue, go all the way around, leave a space open, then I could check it for size over my form. And if it was a cushion, by the way, you make it slightly smaller than your fill because your fill compresses. And then you would permanently sew it, and then you would take it to the next step. That's not the final step of sewing in any case. Right, so that is our running stitch applied as a basting stitch.